The last thing I expected to hear from my son was him begging me for forgiveness, especially not after I signed my name. For 40 years, I built my life around one simple rule. If you plan carefully enough, nothing collapses without warning. Concrete tells you when it is about to crack. Steel complains long before it gives way. I trusted those signals. They never lied to me. People did. I retired on a Thursday morning quietly. No speeches, no applause. I left my office the same way I had entered it decades earlier, believing that what I built would stand even after I stepped away. I thought the same about my family. Years before I retired, my son sat across from me at our kitchen table full of plans, confidence, and ambition. He asked for my support. I gave it freely. Papers were signed. Promises were made. Everyone said it was just a formality, something that would never matter. That was my first mistake, because slowly, without confrontation or noise, I stopped being part of the conversation. My name stayed on the documents. My voice disappeared from the decisions. I told myself this was what stepping back looked like. Until one night I opened a file I had not looked at in years. What I read made my stomach tighten. That signature I had given out of trust was not just support. It was leverage, power. A line I had agreed to draw without realizing who might one day force me to stand behind it. I did not confront my son. I did not raise my voice. I did not warn anyone. I signed again. And that was when my phone rang. If you have ever trusted someone so completely that you ignored the warning signs, stay with me. Because what happened next turned my son into a man I barely recognized standing on my porch, asking me for forgiveness. I retired on a Thursday morning with no speeches and no handshakes. I shut the door to my office for the last time and placed the keys on the corner of the desk, where I had left them every evening for decades. The building was quiet in a way it never had been before. Concrete settles when the day heats up. Steel answers back at night. After 40 years in construction, you learn to hear those sounds. They tell you when something is holding and when something is about to give. At 64, I told myself I had earned the right to slow down. My knees disagreed when I stood too long. My hands moved slower when I buttoned my shirt in the morning. But habits do not retire easily. I still woke before dawn. Still poured coffee while running numbers in my head. Still scanned for problems that had not happened yet. That mindset built my career. I did not make my living on bold guesses or lucky breaks. I made it by planning for failure, by asking what could go wrong and preparing for it quietly long before anyone else noticed the hairline cracks. That instinct followed me home even when I tried to leave it behind. Years earlier, when my son Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table with his first real estate proposal, I felt that familiar pull. He was in his early 30s then, confident, well-dressed, talking fast about duplexes and small commercial buildings outside Dallas. I saw myself in him, and I saw what he could not yet see. Risk. We stayed up late that night. Papers spread between us. He explained his vision. I asked questions, real ones, about debt exposure, about market swings, about what happened if tenants walked or rates climbed. He answered most of them well enough. When his attorney joined us, the conversation turned technical. Somewhere in the middle of it, a provision came up, a contingency clause, a safeguard. The lawyer said it was standard, a formality, something no one ever expected to use. Daniel rolled his eyes and smiled at me. He told me it was just to keep everyone comfortable, that nothing would ever come of it. I believed him. Or maybe I believed in him. I signed because that is what fathers do when they trust their sons. I signed because I saw myself as support, not resistance. The ink dried. The documents were filed. The folder went into my cabinet. I did not think about that clause again for a long time. Daniel built his company fast, faster than I expected. He had a gift for persuasion that I never did. Where I was methodical, he was magnetic. Deals closed, properties multiplied. His name began to show up in places mine never had. At first I was proud, quietly proud. I stood in the background at openings, shook hands, let him take the spotlight. When people asked what role I played, I told them I was retired. That this was his thing now. I meant it. The shift came slowly. So slowly I almost missed it. Meetings I was no longer invited to. Emails where my name appeared at the bottom after decisions had already been made. Documents sent for signature with no explanation attached. One evening, I tried calling Daniel to ask about a refinancing move I had read about in a local business column. The call went to voicemail. He called back later and told me it was handled. No need for me to worry. Everything was under control. There was a pause before he said it, just long enough for me to notice. That pause stayed with me. My name was still on the paperwork, on the guarantees, on the filings. But my role had changed without anyone saying it out loud. I was no longer part of the discussion. I was a formality, a signature. I told myself I was imagining things, that this was what stepping back was supposed to feel like, that retirement meant trusting the next generation to do things their own way. But the unease did not fade. It had nothing to do with money. I had done well enough to be comfortable. It had everything to do with trust. One night after dinner alone, I walked into my study and opened the filing cabinet. I pulled out the folder with Daniel's company name on it. I sat at the desk and flipped through the pages, slowly stopping when I reached the clause I had barely glanced at years earlier. The language was precise, cold. It outlined authority conditions limits. It did not care about intentions or relationships. It existed to define boundaries. I read it twice, then a third time. That was when it hit me. That signature I gave out of trust was not only there to protect the company, it was there to protect me. A line I had agreed to draw without imagining I might one day need to stand behind it. I closed the folder and slid it back into the cabinet. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Retirement had given me time to notice patterns, time to notice distance. As I turned off the desk lamp, my phone buzzed on the table. An email notification. No message preview. Just a subject line from Daniel's office asking me to review and sign an attached document. I stood there for a long moment staring at the screen with the cabinet still open behind me. The screen went dark, and I left the phone on the desk where it was. I did not open the attachment. I did not reply. I stood there a moment longer, then turned off the light and went to bed. Sleep came in fragments. Not the restless kind that comes with anger, but the heavier kind that follows recognition. The kind that settles in once you realize something you cannot unsee. Over the next few days, memories surfaced without effort. Not all at once. One at a time. Quiet. Insistent. I thought about the first check I wrote for Daniel's business. It was 2015, a warm spring morning outside Plano. He had driven over early parking crooked in the driveway because he was too eager to straighten it out. He talked through the deal standing up, pacing hands, moving like he could already see the building rising from the dirt. He said it was just a down payment, temporary, a bridge until things stabilized. I told him to slow down, to walk the numbers twice, He laughed and said I had always been careful. That was his word. Careful. He said it with affection then. I wrote the check anyway. A few years later, when the market tightened and lenders started hedging their bets, there was the guarantee. $700,000 tied to a loan that made everyone nervous except Daniel. He stood in my study that afternoon, confident, reassuring. He said my name would never actually be needed, that it was just to keep the bank comfortable. I signed without ceremony. I had signed harder things in my life. I did not tell friends. I did not mention it at dinner. I believed support worked best when it stayed invisible. There were other things too. Introductions that opened doors. A zoning contact I had known for decades. A banker who returned my calls because I never wasted his time. I made those connections quietly. Stepped aside once the conversation started. At first, Daniel thanked me every time. He called. He checked in. He asked what I thought before moving forward. Those calls did not stop suddenly. They thinned out. A week between them. Then 2. Then none unless there was paperwork involved. Emily stepped in where Daniel stepped back. She was always polite, always composed. She spoke often about independence and boundaries, about building something that belonged to them. I understood that. Or I thought I did. The documents still came to me, though, usually from her. Short emails, attachments labeled urgent, notes that said they needed something handled quickly, always quickly. I signed, sent them back, told myself each time that it would be the last. It never was. One Sunday afternoon, we all sat down to dinner at their new house. Open layout, neutral colors, everything intentional. Daniel talked about expansion plans. Emily filled in details when he paused. I listened, nodding, letting them lead the conversation. At some point, I asked a question. A simple one. About exposure. About what would happen if several projects stalled at once. Daniel hesitated. He glanced at Emily. She smiled and said they had it covered. The conversation moved on without answering me. I noticed the way eye contact disappeared, the way the subject shifted smoothly away from risk. I had seen that look before, on job sites, in meetings where someone hoped a weak spot would go unnoticed. Avoidance has a rhythm if you know how to listen. Later that evening, I stood on the patio with a glass of iced tea, watching the yard lights flicker on. An old acquaintance approached me. Someone I had known through industry circles for years. He spoke casually like he was sharing an observation. He said Daniel was doing well. Really well. He said it must be a relief for me finally stepping back after being so involved for so long. Then he added something else almost as an aside, that it sounded like Daniel was carving his own path now, getting out from under my control. The word hit harder than I expected. Control. I had heard that word before. Years ago, when a younger project manager accused me of micromanaging because I asked for updated load calculations. Back then, I learned that people often call caution control when it slows them down. Standing there on that patio, the same feeling returned. Not anger. Something closer to insult. I smiled and nodded because correcting him would have turned it into a scene. But the word stayed with me long after the night ended. I drove home with the radio off. The highway stretched ahead, empty and familiar. I realized how easily silence allows a story to rewrite itself. When you stop speaking, other people fill in the gaps. At home, I finally opened the email I had ignored. Another document, another place to sign. No explanation, no context, just expectation. I signed it again. That night, sleep came slowly. Gratitude does not vanish overnight. It erodes. It turns into routine, then into entitlement. When help becomes reliable, sacrifice becomes invisible. Over the next few weeks, the pattern grew clearer. Conversations cut short. Decisions announced instead of discussed. Meetings scheduled without notice. I was no longer being asked. I was being used efficiently. I did not confront Daniel. Not yet. Part of me hoped this was still temporary, that this was just the awkward phase of stepping back. Another part of me recognized the warning signs. I had seen what happens when people assume support will always hold the load. One evening I stood again in my study. I did not open the filing cabinet. I did not need to. The words of that clause were already clear in my mind. Authority. Conditions. Limits. I thought about how my name now traveled through rooms I was no longer invited into. How my signature carried weight without my voice attached to it. The help I gave was never meant to buy loyalty. It was meant to give my son a foundation. Somewhere along the way, that foundation became something he stood on without looking down. As I turned off the light, my phone vibrated on the desk. A call this time, from Daniel. It was late. Later than he ever called unless something was wrong. The message he left was brief. He said he needed to talk. Tonight, if possible. Something time-sensitive. I sat down slowly, phone still in my hand, aware for the first time that whatever came next would not be handled with another quiet signature. I returned the call a few minutes later. Daniel answered on the second ring, his voice tight, already moving. He did not ask how I was. He did not make space for small talk. He went straight to the point the way people do when they believe time is money and both are running out. He said a project had stalled, permits delayed, a partner getting nervous. Cash flow stretched thinner than expected. He spoke fast, listing facts like bullet points as if speed could replace certainty. I listened, leaning against the desk, watching the glow from the lamp pool across the wood. I asked when this had started. There was a pause. Short, measured. He said it had been developing for a while. Nothing serious at first. Manageable. He said they thought they had it handled. I asked why I was only hearing about it now. Another pause. This one longer. He said they needed help moving things along, that the numbers would settle once the next tranche cleared, that it was temporary. Temporary again. I asked for details. Not all of them. Just enough to understand the exposure. He brushed past the question and came back to the solution. Money. A signature. A bridge to get them through. I stood there listening to my son talk about risk, the way people talk about weather. Something inconvenient, but out of their control. He mentioned my name as if it were already part of the fix, as if my involvement were assumed, not requested. At one point, he said it almost casually. He said I could sign the paperwork and it would buy them time. He said I always did. You always sign. The words landed heavier than he seemed to realize. I said nothing at first. I let the silence stretch long enough for him to notice. He filled it with reassurance, with explanations, with promises that this would be the last time. I ended the call without agreeing to anything. I told him I needed to look at the documents. He sounded relieved, as if that alone solved the problem. After we hung up, I stayed where I was, phone still in my hand. The house was quiet. The cabinet in my study sat closed, but I could picture the folder inside it without opening it. The clause. The lines I had read and reread. I replayed the conversation in my head slower this time. The parts he emphasized, the parts he avoided, The way he never once asked if I was comfortable with the risk. It was not anger I felt. It was disappointment. The kind that settles deep because it is rooted in recognition. I saw then what I had been to him for longer than I wanted to admit. I was not a partner, not a mentor, not even an advisor. I was a safety net, a backup plan that only mattered when everything else failed. I thought back to the years I spent teaching younger engineers on job sites. I used to tell them that redundancy was necessary, but reliance was dangerous. A safety net is there to catch you if you fall. It is not there to stand on. Somewhere along the way, that distinction had blurred in my own life. The documents arrived the next morning. An email marked urgent, attachments already prepared. I opened them slowly, reading every page this time. The language was familiar. The exposure was real. The risk was not small. I called Daniel back and asked a few pointed questions. He answered them, but not directly. He spoke in generalities, in projections, in confidence. I asked what would happen if things went the other way, if the permits took longer, if the partner pulled out, if the market shifted again. He hesitated, then said that was why my involvement mattered, why my signature made lenders comfortable, why my name smoothed things over. That was the moment it became undeniable. My value to him was not my judgment. It was my credibility, my history, my willingness to absorb impact. I ended the call again, this time more firmly. I told him I would get back to him. The rest of the day passed slowly. I tried to distract myself with routine, yard work, a trip to the hardware store, conversations with neighbors about nothing that mattered. But my mind kept circling back to the same point. Silence had cost me more than I realized. By staying quiet, I had allowed my role to be rewritten. I had allowed trust to turn into entitlement. And now, if I continued the pattern, I would not just be supporting my son. I would be sacrificing my own agency. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread out in front of me. The same table where Daniel once paced, full of plans and optimism. I ran my finger along the margins, stopping at the places where my name appeared. I thought about what would happen if I signed, about how easily this situation would be smoothed over, about how little would change afterward. Then I thought about what would happen if I did not. The idea unsettled me, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt final. I realized then that this was not a financial decision. It was a personal one, a line between being a father who helps and a man who protects his own dignity. I gathered the papers and placed them back in the envelope without signing. I did not know yet what I was going to do. I only knew what I could no longer do. As I turned off the kitchen light, my phone buzzed again. A message from Daniel asking if everything was okay, saying they were under pressure. That time mattered. I set the phone down without replying, aware that the next step would require more than another conversation. I did not answer Daniel that night. I needed distance from his urgency, from the way his voice had already decided the outcome. The next morning, after pacing the kitchen with a mug of coffee growing cold in my hand, I made a call I had been avoiding for weeks. Mark Henderson picked up on the second ring. His voice sounded the same as it had for years, calm, unhurried, already listening, before I said a word. We met that afternoon at his office near downtown Fort Worth. A squat brick building with a narrow parking lot and a faded flag out front. I had driven past it more times than I could count without giving it much thought. Inside it smelled faintly of paper and old coffee. Mark stood when I walked in, shook my hand, and looked at me the way people do when they sense something heavier than small talk. He said I did not usually show up without a reason. I told him I wanted to understand my exposure. That was all. I did not say my son's name yet. I placed the documents on his desk and sat back. Mark read slowly. He always did. No scanning. No shortcuts. When he finished, he removed his glasses and rested them on the folder. He asked me how often I signed things without reading them carefully. I told him often enough to regret it now. He nodded once, not judging, just acknowledging a fact. Then he said something that shifted the room. He said, "The law does not care why you sign. It does not care about family or good intentions. A signature is consent. Once it is there, the story behind it stops mattering." He explained how scanned signatures are stored and reused, how a pattern of past behavior can establish implied authority, how years of cooperation, without objection, can be used to prove expectation. He spoke in plain language the way he always did, laying out consequences without drama. I asked him if my name could be used on documents I had never personally reviewed. He said yes, under certain conditions, especially given my history. My stomach tightened in a way I had not felt since my first big project went sideways decades ago. Mark opened a drawer and pulled out a copy of an old agreement. He slid it next to the papers I had brought. The contingency clause. The one I had barely glanced at when I signed it years earlier. He pointed to specific lines, then looked at me. He said that clause was not there to protect my son's company. It was there to protect me. I told him it felt wrong to even consider using it. Like betrayal. Like turning my back on my own child. Mark did not argue. He leaned back in his chair and said something quieter. He said, "Protecting yourself is not betrayal. It is responsibility. The same responsibility I had practiced my entire career. The kind that keeps people safe when things fail." He reminded me of a bridge project we had worked on together years ago. Temporary supports, redundant systems, precautions that slowed everything down. He said no one called that mistrust. They called it professionalism. Family does not cancel that rule. As he spoke, a different feeling crept in. Not fear. Embarrassment. I realized how long I had ignored my own standards at home. How easily I had accepted risk there that I would never tolerate on a job site. I asked Mark what would happen if things went wrong, and my signature was already tied to the deal. He did not soften the answer. He said liability does not retire when you do. He said personal assets can be exposed, retirement accounts included. He said good intentions do not shield you in court. That was the moment something dropped in my chest. A simple image formed in my mind. Years of careful planning undone by a decision I had treated like routine. When I left his office, the sun was low, stretching long shadows across the sidewalk. I sat in my truck for a while without starting the engine. I was not overwhelmed. I was recalibrating. I had spent my life insisting on safeguards that irritated people. I had slowed projects down to get them right. I had done it because failure always costs more than caution. Somewhere along the way, I had abandoned that principle where it mattered most. That evening, Daniel called again. I watched the phone light up on the counter and let it ring. His voicemail was shorter this time, less confident. He said they were under pressure, that lenders were asking questions, that they needed reassurance. I did not call him back. Instead, I spread the documents across my kitchen table once more. I read them with different eyes, not as a father looking to help, but as a man measuring risk. I saw pathways now, not just obligations, but consequences. I understood that doing nothing was also a decision, one that carried its own weight. The line Mark had pointed out stayed with me, the one that defined when authority shifted, the one I had agreed to years ago without imagining I might ever need it. For the first time, I did not see that clause as an act of disloyalty. I saw it as a boundary I had neglected. As night settled in, my phone buzzed again. A message from Daniel asking if I had spoken to anyone, asking what I was thinking. I turned the phone face down and rested my hands on the table. The law had made one thing clear. Good intentions had carried me this far. They would not protect me from what came next. That understanding stayed with me into the morning. I woke before the sun and sat at the kitchen table while the house was still dark, the same table where so many decisions had once been talked through out loud. The papers were stacked neatly in front of me. I did not feel rushed. I did not feel angry. I felt the way I used to feel before a concrete pour, when every measurement had been checked, and the only thing left was to follow through. I made coffee and forgot to drink it. I read every page again, slowly, not hoping for a loophole, not arguing with myself, just confirming what was already clear. The language was precise, indifferent. It did not bend to sentiment. My phone buzzed while I was reading. A message from Daniel saying lenders were asking questions. Another a few minutes later saying time mattered. I turned the phone face down and kept going. When I reached the page Mark had pointed out, I stopped. The clause sat there exactly as it always had. Authority defined. Conditions spelled out. Consequences implied. I remembered signing it years earlier with a casual confidence, assuming it would never matter. I picked up the pen and held it for a moment. I thought about a lesson I had repeated to younger engineers my entire career. Measure twice. Act once. The damage usually comes from rushing past, the moment when you should slow down. My hand was steady, I signed. Once. Clean and deliberate. I did not call Daniel. I did not explain myself or soften the edges. I placed the papers back in the envelope and called Mark's office. I told his assistant I needed everything filed immediately. She said it would be handled. That was it. The response was quicker than I expected. By early afternoon, emails started arriving. Automated notices, bank confirmations, guarantees connected to my name were being reviewed. Credit lines paused. Transactions flagged for additional verification. There was no drama in it, no confrontation, just systems responding the way they were designed to respond once assumptions were removed. Daniel called again. I let it ring. By evening, his messages changed tone. Less confidence. More questions. He said something was wrong, that deals were slowing down, that partners wanted clarification. I did not answer. The next morning, I heard from people I had not spoken to in years. A banker asking for confirmation. A former contact wanting to understand the change. They did not ask why. They asked how. That was when I understood the real impact of what I had done. The signature did not punish my son. It removed the invisible support he had been standing on. It forced everything that had relied on my quiet presence to move into the open. That realization left me hollow, not satisfied. I had expected anger or relief. Instead, there was an emptiness, the absence of a role I had carried for so long that I barely noticed it had shaped my days. That afternoon, I drove past one of Daniel's properties on my way home. Work was still happening. Lights on. Trucks in the lot. The world had not stopped. It had simply adjusted. At home, I sat in the living room with the lights off, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. My phone buzzed again. A voicemail this time. Daniel's voice sounded unfamiliar. Not frustrated. Uncertain. He said he needed to talk, that things were moving faster than he expected, that he did not understand how it had all changed so quickly. I listened once and set the phone down. Over the next few days, Mark confirmed what was already becoming clear. Protections were active. My exposure was reduced. Nothing dramatic. Just boundaries finally enforced. I thanked him and ended the call. Standing alone in the kitchen, I stared at the spot on the table where the papers had been. The house felt the same. Quiet. Orderly. But I did not. I had not acted out of anger. I had acted out of necessity. That distinction mattered more than I expected. One closed doors, the other defined them. Late that evening, another message came through from Daniel. He asked if he could come by the next day. Not to sign anything, not to ask for help, just to talk. I set the phone down without replying. For the first time, I understood that the conversation ahead would not be the kind we had always had. It would not be about smoothing things over. It would be about facing what happens when the safety net is finally pulled away. The knock came the next afternoon, lighter than I expected. Not impatient, not demanding. I knew it was Daniel before I reached the door. I took a breath and opened it. He stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders slightly rounded. Eyes tired in a way I had never seen before. No suit, no practiced confidence. Just my son, stripped of the armor he had worn for years. I stepped aside and let him in. There was no embrace, no handshake. He walked into the living room and stopped looking around as if he needed a moment to remember where he was. The house had not changed. He had. He began talking before either of us sat down. The words came unevenly. He said things had unraveled faster than he expected. That partners were nervous. That lenders were asking questions he did not have answers for. He said he thought he understood the risk, but now he saw how much of it had been resting on assumptions he never named out loud. I listened and said nothing. Silence has a way of pulling the truth out of people when they run out of prepared lines. He paced once, then stopped. He said he never meant to push me out, that he thought independence meant handling things without leaning so hard on anyone. He admitted that somewhere along the way, leaning turned into expecting. That word sat between us. Expecting. He finally looked at me, not with frustration or defensiveness, but with something closer to fear. He said he was not just worried about the company. He was scared of losing control of his life, of realizing he had built something that only worked because someone else was quietly holding it up. The apology did not come cleanly. He circled it, explained, corrected himself. Then his voice dropped, and he said it plainly. "Please forgive me, Dad." For a moment, instinct rose up in me like it always had. The urge to fix it, to tell him it would be okay, to reach across the room and offer reassurance that would make the fear leave his eyes. I felt my mouth start to form words I had spoken 100 times before. I stopped myself. I asked him to sit. He lowered himself onto the edge of the couch, unsure hands clasped the way he used to sit when he was a boy, waiting for a verdict. I asked him when he stopped wanting my opinion and started needing my signature. The question was quiet. It was not an accusation. He stared at the floor for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said it happened slowly. That success made him feel like he had to prove he was capable on his own. That every time he leaned on me, a part of him felt smaller. So he leaned harder in the other direction, even when it meant stepping past me instead of standing beside me. I told him I could see the regret on his face and that it mattered. I also told him regret does not erase consequences. He nodded. No argument. no defense. That alone told me how far he had fallen from where he thought he stood. I could see the fear beneath the apology now. Not fear of losing money, but fear of standing without a net, of realizing the ground was not as solid as he believed. The room went quiet again. I felt the weight of what needed to be said, and how easily it could be undone with one careless promise. I told him I had spent my life planning for failure so other people would not have to experience it. I told him that somewhere along the way I had protected him from learning how to do that for himself. That part was on me. We sat there with that truth for a while. It was not comfortable. It was honest. He asked if I was going to change my mind. He did not say it directly, but the question was there, fragile, waiting. I told him forgiveness and reversal were not the same thing, that I forgave him because I did not want anger to be the thing that defined what was left between us. But forgiving him did not mean undoing the boundary I had finally set. His shoulders dropped, not in collapse, but in acceptance. I saw something settle in him then. The realization that this was not a negotiation. He stood to leave a few minutes later. At the door, he paused and turned back. He said he did not know how to do this without me. I told him learning how might be the most important part. After he left, the house felt still, not empty, just quiet in a new way. I sat in the chair long after his car disappeared down the street, replaying the moment when I almost promised more than I should. My phone vibrated on the side table. A message from Mark confirming another review request had come in that morning. More questions, more scrutiny. The consequences were still unfolding. I set the phone down and leaned back, knowing the conversation with my son had not closed anything. It had only made the shape of what came next unavoidable. The days after our conversation settled into a quieter rhythm, but the weight of it stayed with me. Forgiveness had been spoken out loud, yet nothing had been undone. I felt that distinction in the small spaces of the day, in the way I moved through the house and the pauses before I reached for my phone. Daniel did not call the next morning, or the one after that. When he finally did reach out, it was different from before. No urgency, no pressure, just short messages updating me on what was happening. A lender wanted revised numbers. A partner was stepping back until things stabilized. Timelines were being pushed. I read each message and set the phone down. I did not offer advice unless he asked directly. When he did ask, I answered only what he needed to know and nothing more. No extra guidance, no quiet corrections. Letting go felt unnatural, like leaving a job half-finished. There were moments when restraint felt like cruelty. I had spent years equating involvement with care, and now care meant stepping back. Each time I felt the urge to intervene, I remembered the look on his face when he understood I would not reverse the decision. Not anger, not resentment, recognition. Outside our family, the story shifted as well. The first people who reached out did so cautiously, as if they were testing the ground beneath their own assumptions. A banker I had worked with for decades called to confirm procedures. He did not question my motives. He said it made sense. Boundaries were necessary when lines had been blurred for too long. Another contact mentioned hearing that I had pulled back. The word control came up again, but this time it sounded different. Not accusation. Context. He said people were starting to understand that what once looked like control had really been responsibility that went unnoticed until it was gone. I did not defend myself. I did not correct the narrative. I had learned that clarity does not require explanation once the facts stand on their own. Daniel felt the change more directly. Without my name smoothing conversations, everything slowed. Decisions that once moved on trust now required proof. Assumptions had to be spoken. Risk had to be acknowledged. It frustrated him, but it also forced him to see the structure of what he had built. We met once for coffee mid-morning, a neutral place neither of us owned. He looked tired, but there was something steadier in him. Less frantic, more present. He talked about learning how much he had relied on momentum, how often he had mistaken speed for stability. I listened. I asked questions when they mattered. I did not offer solutions. That was the hardest part. At one point, he asked if I regretted my decision. The question was quiet and unguarded. I told him it hurt, but I did not regret it. Regret would mean I believed there was another way to teach this lesson without sacrificing something important. I no longer believed that. He nodded. No argument. That was becoming a pattern. Late at night alone in the house, doubts still crept in. Love has a way of reopening doors you have already closed. I wondered if I had waited too long or acted too firmly. Each time I returned to the same truth. The door was closed not to punish, but to protect. Both of us. Forgiveness allowed us to keep speaking. Refusal to reverse forced honesty. Over the following weeks, I watched Daniel begin to stand differently. Not confidently, not yet, but deliberately. He attended meetings he used to delegate. He asked questions he had once avoided. He admitted uncertainty instead of hiding it behind speed. He did not thank me for that. He did not need to. Growth rarely feels like a gift when you are inside it. For me, the pain of the decision did not disappear. It settled into something quieter. A reminder that love without limits eventually turns into something else. Something that feels generous but erodes both sides. One afternoon, I stopped by the hardware store to pick up a few things for the house. An older man I recognized from years back nodded at me in the aisle. He said he had heard about the situation with my son. He did not pry. He simply said it must have taken courage to draw a line when it would have been easier not to. The comment stayed with me long after I left the store. Not because it validated me, but because it reminded me that restraint is visible even when it is quiet. That evening, Daniel called. He said they had lost a deal, but learned something important in the process. He did not ask me to fix it. Before hanging up, he said this was the first time he felt like what happened next was actually his responsibility. After the call ended, I sat in the living room and let that sink in. Forgiveness had kept us connected. Boundaries had forced accountability. Both were necessary. Neither was easy. As night settled in, I realized that the story between us was no longer about control or rebellion. It was about ownership, of choices, of consequences, of the road ahead. For the first time in a long while, I was no longer afraid of what my son might become without my constant support. I was uncertain, but I was not afraid. That felt like a quiet kind of progress. Whatever came next would test that ownership, and this time I would not be the one absorbing the impact for him. Time kept moving steady and indifferent the way it always does. Weeks folded into months, and the space between my son and me settled into something quieter. We did not drift apart, but we did not return to what we once were either. What grew in that space was slower and more honest, built without urgency. We spoke less often. When we did, the conversations were grounded. No assumptions. No shortcuts. Daniel told me about deals that stalled and some that fell apart entirely. He also mentioned the first small win that came without my name attached to it. I heard pride in his voice, then the careful kind that does not need approval. I felt relief, but not the relief of victory. It was the relief of alignment. of finally standing where I should have been standing all along on my side of the line. There were mornings when I missed the old rhythm, the calls asking what I thought, the sense of being needed. That feeling does not disappear just because you recognize it as dangerous. It lingers waiting for a quiet moment. I learned to sit with it instead of acting on it. One Saturday morning, I fixed a loose hinge on the back door, a small thing I had ignored for months. The screwdriver slipped once, then caught. The door closed cleanly after that, no creak, no resistance. I stood there longer than necessary, hand still on the handle, realizing how much of my life had been spent forcing doors that should have been adjusted instead. Later that week, I found myself near a small renovation site by habit, watching a crew pour concrete. The smell, the sound, the careful pace of it all felt familiar. Someone asked if I wanted to take a look at their measurements. I shook my head and smiled. They had it covered. Walking away, I recognized the feeling, trusting without hovering, caring without controlling. Daniel came by the house again a few months later. Not in crisis, not asking for anything. We sat on the porch as the evening cooled, listening to cicadas settle into the trees. He told me he was still figuring things out, that some days scared him more than others, that he finally understood what it meant to carry responsibility without a net beneath him. I told him fear was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign that the stakes were real. He nodded and let the silence stretch. We had learned how to do that again. I thought often about the man I had been before that signature and the man I became after it. The difference was not in how much I loved my son. That had never changed. The difference was in what I was willing to give up to prove that love. For years, I believed endurance was the same as virtue, that a good father absorbed impact so his child would not have to. I did not understand how often that robs someone of the chance to grow. The signature did not fix everything. It did not suddenly make Daniel wiser or remove doubt from my own mind. What it did was force me to choose dignity alongside love instead of trading one for the other. There was a calm that came with that choice. Not happiness. Calm. The kind that lets you sleep through the night without replaying conversations or bracing for the next request. People around me noticed before I did. A friend said I sounded lighter. Someone else said I seemed more sure of myself. I did not feel lighter. I felt aligned. I had spent decades building structures meant to hold weight. In the end, the most important structure I built was a boundary. The relationship with my son did not return to what it was. It became something better, something rooted in truth instead of obligation. We spoke as two men now, not as a rescuer and someone being rescued. Looking back, I see that the final signature did not change my son right away. It changed me. It turned me from a man who endured quietly into a man who stood deliberately. I still love my son, I always will, but I no longer believe love requires erasing yourself to keep the peace. Sometimes I think about the version of myself from years ago sitting at that kitchen table signing without hesitation. If I could speak to him now, I would not tell him to be harder or colder. I would tell him this. Love needs a spine. Without it, it collapses under its own weight. If there is one question that remains with me, it is this. Does forgiveness always mean going back to the way things were, or does it sometimes mean choosing not to? If this story sounded familiar, if you have stood at a line like this or feel yourself approaching one, you are not alone. Stay here a moment. Listen. Share what this stirred in you. Sometimes the strongest thing a father can do is stop carrying what his child must learn to hold.